Welcome to Future Culture episode 00X. Still trying to figure out the correct format as I'm exploring various parks in Berlin. This is a park in Friedrichshain, and I am in some kind of fairy tale fountain thing. Oops, it's a busy day today, and fairy tales, what are they? Do they have importance, a deeper meaning? Can we say, when we talk about the future, that the future is also a fairy tale in many ways? A fairy tale we tell ourselves about ourselves. But who is this self? That's the question. The thing, the it, the I, that is able to identify as such and to absorb all this information, categorize it and rationalize it, and reconceptualize that packaging according to what we conform to, either by our own will or by circumstances, by family traits or religious impulses or governmental implementations like nationalism. A nationalist self is very different than, let's say, an omnipotent spiritual self. And the self in itself is a fairy tale. It does not exist. It's not a permanent thing. Trying to stay out of the way of everybody. It's not a sculpture. It's not set in stone, but is fluctuating almost daily, impacted by news we conceive, absorb, and label. Can be good or bad, that's not the point. But our biology, this vehicle, this thing we use that houses our consciousness, the body, has to deal with all the hormones that are pumped out, especially if they're triggered, let's say, by fear impulses or by beautiful desires like love or erotic needs that want to be satisfied and are stimulated by what we see and encounter. That means, in a weird way, we have to accept that the self we talk so much, even have an internal dialogue, basically constantly arguing about the next step we're going to take, and in some ways perceive as stationary in us. This self, the stationary self, this fixed point, does not exist. I think we have to agree to that degree. And of course, the mind, the self itself, will fight this statement, because the self has created a system so it can exist, so it can survive, and has established some egoistic parts. The ego is part of that self structure. And then the self becomes the ego, and the ego is then busy all day long to confirm its status as the dominant force over our body, and with that over our life. And we become a puppet on a string. But at the same time, weirdly, we are also the puppet master. And not just that, in a more abstract way, we are also the string. Now, what does that all mean? Well, it means, depending on our conditioning and rational faculties, it means whatever we give it meaning. So this is easier said than digested. We have been conditioned from childhood on about what to believe, how to behave, about our purpose, to find a purpose, to search for a purpose, to be on a journey, to reach some kind of illusionary goal, to become like others, to be of value, to be a sufficient member of society. We've been fed all these things, and somehow this has created a personality with traits and has established itself as the persona we call I. This persona, of course, is not the authentic self. It's not an I. It's not who we are, but is acting out who we think we should be, or how we would like to be perceived by others. Others have a big impact on the way we present ourselves, modulate ourselves, and the interpretation of this self, because a lot of times we see the way the world is not just through our own lens, but through the lens of our environment. Conscious or not conscious is in that sense the same. What we are doing is creating a way to present ourselves to be accepted by society. A society too who lives like in a fairy tale land, even like you can see all around. We are building architecture that is reminiscent of storylines, so we can enact in this preset symbolism and become icons in our own movie, in our own novel. We become the star in our own trilogy, so to speak, a blockbuster movie that incorporates all aspects. And these aspects are not all just one big long list of attributes we are proud of, but expose a lot of elements that are what we call, since Carl Jung, the shadow side. And we have learned much and much more that the self, to uphold this, yes, let's say this kingly vision of who we are, my arm is hurting, this kingly vision of who we are, how we want to perceive by others, to uphold that, we start to tell lies about ourselves, not just to others, but to ourselves. This self we have created now becomes a liar that is covering up the truth by enacting mythology. These myths are ancient, many of them from different traditions, but the core mechanism is the same. So we are creating modern day myths in which we live on a daily basis, second by second. And every time we look in the mirror and identify with this image that's reflected back to us, and every time we identify with the thoughts that are constantly produced in our brain through various complicated mechanisms, and maybe not just located in the brain alone, but this is a different subject, because obviously everything I'm saying right now is improvised, is coming from somewhere, was not pre-stored in my brain, was non-local. So if we consider this non-locality of this being that's talking to this camera, it means there is no local self in me. Here we enter metaphysics, esoteric areas, and possibly on a physical level, quantum physics, that are being studied by science right now as we are more and more able to look into the brain insofar as to identify the activity of the different parts and how they interact under certain circumstances. And like after injury, when certain things in the brain are severed, how they enable people to access either supernatural abilities or to detrimental being turned into vegetables. In some cases, they have managed, the brain has managed to repair these areas, but then out of the repair emerges a whole new personality, a new self in the same body. The nature of self, the title alone says it, is a bigger, more complex structure, environment made up of neurons and synapses, proteins, transmitters, receptors, cells. Even the cells have certain receptors that are very unique. They're like the fingerprint to each individual human. That's maybe the closest we get to a self on a biological level. The cells know when particles or things from outside enter. They're not part of this encoding, and they are forced by an ingenious mechanism to fight them off. Of course, sometimes that turns the opposite, and these cells start to fight the body, like in an autoimmune system. But nevertheless, these cells are the self on a biological level. And there are, I don't know, trillions of them. So again, once more, and these cells are not living eternal or living, just as long as our body exists. No, these cells are constantly renewing itself and dying and rebirthing. There's no constant in our body. There's no constant in our brain. The only thing that's constant is these stories we tell ourselves about who we are, where we come from, where we are going, and possibly who we want to be. And that's a very, very good point, a new starting point to look at that. This point of view is essential because it also means we are not subordinate to the self. So we can always supersede it. We can always create another uber structure to decide that this self maybe was valuable for this time frame, for these years of interaction for the growth pattern, whatever rational, perfectly legit excuse we want to take and indulge in. But these selves we have had, because we are not the same self as a child, not the same as a teenager, not even the same self 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and especially since 2020 was such a fascinating year. We're not the self from 2020. So 2021 is, of course, now an invitation to look at the parts we had as companion for all these years, and which ones served us. We can restructure this self, we can call it a new self, the latest version of it, an update, as if, yes, as if we have been re-engineered, partly, yes, under pressure from the outside, but now with all the advances in science and somatic literature, we can alter this self with techniques. Some of these techniques are brand new. They include frequencies and music and sound. Others are ancient, like thousands of years ago from the Vedic texts, where people already established higher levels of consciousness, realizing that we are, yes, we are just putty. We are clay, and we can form ourselves and change trajectory. And we can also stop identifying with an old version of self and allow this new you to emerge free of the limitations of old knowledge. That was it here from the little fairy tale garden temple in Berlin. Future culture, design for the soul. You're welcome. I'm your host, Richard Chimera. Until soon, be well, be swell.